Thanks, Mark. Thanks, IRD. Thanks, Providence. Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to speak on a subject matter that was really brought up already by Daniel Strand in maybe the opening today. This is not planned, but to some extent what I'll be doing is maybe developing some of his ideas, perhaps tweaking or challenging a couple as well. I am going to read a paper. I apologize in advance for that. But I think it's worth my paying attention to it and trying not to sort of go point by point without reference to it. I'm talking about statecraft today, and in particular from the perspective that I know I am the token Catholic speaker this weekend, and I'm happy to fill that role. But I don't think this is just a Catholic perspective on statecraft. In fact, I think, again, it's quite amenable to the things that Dan said that are relatable both to the Methodist theologian Paul Ramsey, to the broader Augustinian tradition that Dan and I both draw on, that Jean Bethke Elshane drew on as well. So there are important ways that we all overlap here. But I do want you also to pay attention, and maybe even ask me about or question an assumption or an argument that I'm going to make about the nature of realism, or the realism that I find acceptable to the Christian perspective. Okay, so just pay attention to that. It's not something that's accepted by everybody. So the just war ethic is an exercise in statecraft, with its suggestion that the primary focus of the ethic is on the maintenance, preservation, and guidance of the politics and governance of nation-states that find themselves inescapably located in an international order of constant flux. As such, the ethic strives to make war possible as an instrument of politics, particularly against realist and pacifist critiques that are joined, as Methodist theologian Paul Ramsey said, in thinking that in war, evil must be done that good may come of it. The pacifist, of course, refuses to do evil, and thus rescinds from statecraft, right? They will not do statecraft. And a famous example of this is Stanley Hauerwas, another Methodist theologian. He refuses to theorize about the state, refuses to provide a theology of the state. Whereas the realist steps in and pursues statecraft by appeal only to the inner order and interests of the state of which he is a part. Because realism and the just war ethic both pursue war in certain contexts, they cannot appear to be close cousins, or species of the same genus. That appearance, I argue, is false. And in fact, the just war ethic shares less with realism than realism shares with pacifism. The statecraft pursued by realism diverges from that pursued by the just war ethic in at least 4 ways. And that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to outline 4 ways that there's a divergence between the realism associated with the just war ethic and the other kinds of realism that are not associated with it. First, for realism, international engagements begin from the assumptions of certain kinds of problems. The existence of other states, for instance, creates conditions of suspicion and distrust. No state can presume the goodwill of others, in part because states cannot read each other's intentions, and in part because all assume the others are competitors in their pursuit of power. Thus, the international system is marked by anarchy or polyarchy, or the absence of an ordering power possessing sovereign authority is one of necessary competition and severely limited possibilities of cooperation. Anarchy need not assume relentless conflict. It does, however, assume that states always act in their self-interests and to the extent that is permitted by their power. Indeed, states always act to maximize their power or to create the conditions of the future maximization of power at the expense of other states. The erstwhile father of realism, Niccolo Machiavelli, claimed all men are evil, and that they are always going to act according to the wickedness of their spirits whenever they have free scope to do so. The task of the statesman in this account, therefore, is accordingly to use his power to anticipate, prevent, and restrain the wicked acts of his opponents to the extent possible. The second divergence is that the realist assumes the job of the state, and therefore of statecraft, is to pursue the state's interests narrowly conceived. This entails pursuing the increase of its power in relationship with other states, and as realists often maintain, doing so without the regard for the interests of other states, peoples, or the international community, except insofar as those interests are related to the interest of the state itself. Okay? In other words, states always pursue their own interests and only derivatively, if at all, pursue other concerns. They would never, as John Mearsheimer writes, work together to promote world order for its own sake. Instead, realist statecraft is interested in a world order justified only in terms of national interest. Peaceful world order or stability, then, is no more than the unintended consequence of self-interested state behavior ordered to the pursuit of power. It is not something pursued in itself or to be maintained at any cost to a state. Further, it makes no reference to justice. World order makes no reference to justice. World order is a non-moral category. Mearsheimer points to the Cold War as an instance of this. The international stability we can ascribe to the Cold War was the unintended result of US and Soviet joint pursuit of power. Neither sought stability for its own sake. Instead, each worked to undermine the other, despite the obvious consequence that weakening the other power imperiled that stable order. The necessary law of power maximization, the realist argues, compelled each to seek to prevail against the other, despite the predictable adverse effects on the stability of world order. Each did this because, according to realism, that's what states do. They seek to maximize their power at the expense of others. Third divergence. Typically, realism aligns with the full-bodied conception of state sovereignty. Okay? Typically, realism aligns with the kind of full-bodied conception of state sovereignty that is contrary to Christian claims about the sovereignty possible for human governance. On the one hand, we can be sympathetic, and just war theorists will be sympathetic to realist conceptions of sovereignty that resist the equally flawed internationalist conception by which state sovereignty is limited only by the sovereignty claimed by some international institution. Okay? The internationalists will claim, yes, there are limitations on state sovereignty, but those limitations are the sovereignty of other regional or international organizations. The realists then and the internationalists share, against the just war statesman, a conception of sovereignty that is alien to Christian claims. Neither the realist nor the internationalist recognizes that sovereignty in the sense they are claiming has been claimed for the rule of Christ alone, and that states of whatever size or jurisdiction possess an imperfect and therefore limited sovereignty to judge within their jurisdiction in accordance with an order ruled by Christ. Their sovereignty is a pale shadow of Christ's true sovereignty. Who thought the Catholic guy was going to be saying Christ so much?
Hallelujah!
Right? About time somebody mentioned it, okay?
Welcome to the home team.
We'll talk about that later. Okay, the realists of the internationalists think full sovereignty on earth possible, and disagree merely on the principles of its division. According to the false view, political authority can be fully sovereign in the sense of creating order and even justice by its own activity. Those acts are self-justifying, as their justification points to the good of the community the acts serve, absent any reference to external measures by which they might be judged. What makes a political act good, according to this false conception of a sovereignty? The good of the community as determined by those in governance. How do they know that act is good? Because they have determined its service to the good that they govern. The only basis for questioning the judgment of political authority, then, could be internal to that community. That is, in the light of an alternative claim about how the political act actually does serve that community. A consequence of this false conception of sovereignty is the proliferation of claims of right. So many states, so many claims of right, each incapable of critical penetration of the other. Statecraft on this model is assertion, counter-assertion of claims only resolved by the instruments of force. Cognizant of the absurdity and threat of independent states claiming contradictory conceptions of rights, The internationalist appeals for a world state to bring peace and harmony by the articulation of a hegemonic conception of right. How do you solve, in other words, the conundrum produced by sovereign states impenetrably claiming right in their own name? You collapse the sovereign states into one. Assertion meets no counter-assertion, only the receding echo of the righteousness of a claim as it crosses the globe. That solution, however, and I think most people in the room will recognize, is worse than the problem it seeks to solve, because it begins from the same flawed understanding of sovereignty and adds to it the impracticality and the sheer horror of governance by world authority. The realists, anticipating that disagreement and conflict are not solved by a hegemonic imposition of right onto diverse political cultures, reasonably favors the anarchic state system over the internationalist alternative. It is not enough to claim against this view of sovereignty, as Helmut Thielicke, who was a famous Protestant theologian from the middle of the 20th century, it is not enough to claim against that false or wrongful conception of sovereignty, according to Thielicke, that the absence of horizontal limits would conduce to a rebellion against God of the sort described in the Babel story. As Thielicke explains in his Theological Ethics, this is the volume on politics, a hegemonic world sovereign of the sort that people who were advocating for world authority, and many of them were Catholic in the middle of the 20th century, a hegemonic world sovereign unchecked horizontally by competitive sovereignty claims would be, this is a quotation of his, led to play the role of the Antichrist. Okay, right? That hegemonic world authority would actually perform as Antichrist, because it would be unchecked assertion of right without any sort of external measure of it. He continues to point out the loss of the world's unity in sin. That loss of unity precedes and makes impossible a world state, unless it be a rebellious world state, this is a quote, such as would necessarily precipitate a repetition of what happened at the Tower of Babel, the casting off of people into confusion of tongues and conflicting interests and claims. Realism is thus intimately concerned with the activity of states. In this, it shares concerns with just war statesmanship, in particular the emphasis on the service of power to the goods of real communities of people organized by governments into states. Realist claims can seem amoral, but they are not. Realists seek to avoid the explosion of conflict into war by the exercise of power. If we think in terms of order and justice, both of which compose the piece described by the just war ethic, realists ordinarily prefer order to justice, and would not chase justice at the expense of order, unless compelled to do so by state self-interest. They prefer, instead, a limited peace provided by a political order to the pursuit of the greater justice at the expense of that peace. Realism thus imposes rules upon state and government behavior. All political activity must be coordinated toward the general interests of the particular people the government serves. Therefore, the tight jurisdictional conception of the right to wage war that flows from that government's responsibility for that nation's conception of the common good. This claim limits state activity from pursuing justice in the abstract, including recent neoconservative aspirations to place power at the disposal of world reordering, or justice under the guise of a supposed responsibility of states to protect, otherwise known as R2P. Realists, and this was pointed out earlier, will also have dim views about the capacity of military force to effectuate political restructuring, and suspicions about the motivations involved. They will understand them to be self-interest masked as other concern. Certainly, realism has deep theoretical and practical objections to state behavior that appears to express these international concerns. All such behavior has to be viewed, first of all, as self-interested. If they cannot be closely connected with the maximization of state power, they would therefore be impossible to justify from realist points of view. The fourth and final disagreement with realism, and where it diverges from the just war realism, centers around what I'm going to call its determinism. Harken back to some of the quotations I read to you before, the descriptions I made of realism before. Realism makes claims about persons and governments contradicted by central claims of the just war ethic. In particular, realism begins from two fundamental presuppositions not shared by the just war ethic. First, it claims people, and people in politics especially, are bad. This is a point I think that Dan made in his paper as well, right? Realism begins with, we could argue, a kind of fundamental conception about, original sin and its effects on all of us, or just about, sort of reading the world and seeing, the nastiness of human beings towards each other. But that can't be the complete story. It's neither the complete story of a sort of empirical, right, sort of review of what happens in the world among peoples or among states, nor is it arguably the full story of Scripture about sin's effects on human beings, the capacity of good people to act well or out of good motivations towards each other. So it claims people are bad. Therefore, they always will act out of self-interest, even when not conscious of this. The political activity of states, inasmuch as they follow from deliberations and judgments made by those people, will therefore do the same. They will act predictably and in accordance with those interests. Thus, Machiavelli could claim, all cities and peoples have the same desires and the same traits, and they have always had them. Okay, it's really important to his way of understanding the operation of a good prince, right, or a good politician, to be able to make this kind of claim. All states, all peoples are going to act in the same way. Why? Because they're all bad in the same way. They're all always going to be acting out of self-interest. If that's not true, right, then you're going to have a different kind of account of what it means to be a good statesman, or what it means to have good statesmanship. They will act to preserve themselves at any cost so long as they are free to do so. Likewise, contemporary realists assume the operations of raw self-interested power beneath all political acts. Though they differ in kind, the acts will always be explicable and anticipatable in terms of the interests of the states and those in power. How do you know how to respond to what states might do? You just assume, you try to project. What are their interests, right? Which is not a bad exercise, right? But to connote that it's deterministic is a different thing. Though realism is not amoral, just war statesmanship rejects many of its claims in favor of certain internationalist moves realists would never accept, including moves open to humanitarian intervention and the development of regional and international institutions of judgment, like the International Court of Justice. The just war ethic remoralizes just cause. It remoralizes war. Put it differently, this is the way I argue in my book, it makes it possible for politics and the pursuit of certain kinds of goods. State claims of right are not self-justifying, according to the just war ethic. State claims of right are not self-justifying. They can be assessed and criticized by anyone. According to the criterion of right authority, the political act makes a claim about right in the context of love of neighbor and enemy that challenges the state-bound conception of authority and therefore the conception of state sovereignty embedded in national law. The just war ethic conception of right authority embraces the extension of political responsibility beyond state borders to the extent that states are responsible for injustice outside their borders and that they may be capable of addressing. And because provoked by the universality of the gospel, the ethic recognizes a fundamental unity of persons beneath the plurality of states and peoples. The unity of persons, coupled with Christ's dominion, places all states under his judgment for their care of the people that he claims. He claims them all, right? So states, those who are in positions of government, to go back to the language of providence that Dan brought up earlier, are providentially in positions of responsibility, and they do have to attend to the way the exercise of their power impacts people outside their own communities. War, though itself a symptom of the disruption caused by human sinfulness, nonetheless remains an instrument of peace so long as it abides principles derivative of the fundamental unity of humankind. War, therefore, brings to the statesman an opportunity to expand the possibilities of better and expanded institutions of negotiation and mediation post-conflict. Yet acknowledging the reality of a fundamental unity beyond the nation-state does not presuppose an internationalist or imperial or cosmopolitan ethic. Instead, the acknowledgement provides the coherence necessary to think of a morality binding even the practice of war. States draw on an order beyond themselves and beyond their own sovereignty. okay, one that their own sovereignty in fact presupposes. They must look to the wisdom of other states vying for and expressing their own sovereignty in a coherent, if conflictual, order of states marked out by an implicit and an explicit international law. One of my favorite writers on this is a German lawyer. His name is Heinrich Raumann, and he put it this way: the duty of the state in international cooperation for the realization of the international common good is a complement of its undisturbed right of existence as an independent, sovereign national order. The independence, this is me now, the independence and relative autonomy of individual political communities presupposes an order of which they are a part, just as the sovereignty of an individual presupposes the community of which he or she is a part. Sovereignty always raises a with regard to what or to whom question, solved in the case of war by reference to the wider community that becomes the context within which peace is pursued. To disregard that wider community would be a failure of statesmanship, as the job of the statesman is to seek the overlap between the good of the community he or she represents with the good of the wider community always coming into being. Thank you very much. Questions? Dishes are flying. Yes, Brad.
Thank you, that was really wonderful. However, given that just 2 days ago we celebrated Reformation Day, I couldn't help but be struck by the quote about the claim to hegemonic world authority being antichrist.
Right.
Seems to me this was exactly the claim that the reformers made about the nature of papal authority and its international juridical claims in the Reformation. So I wonder if that wasn't a more presentation of a Protestant theory of statecraft and Catholic. Please respond.
Right. Well, no, it's not a Protestant presentation. For at least a couple of reasons. It's given by Catholic, although it's also Jewish. But no, look. The question obviously is provocative, but also a good question, right? Because there are going to be times when when the Catholic claims about ecclesial jurisdiction and political jurisdiction, really kind of merge and inform each other. And we've seen, at least for some period of time, some centuries right now, right, a kind of departure of the jurisdictional nature of those claims, where, as Pope Benedict will put it, right, there's a kind of legitimate and rightful secularity of the political order. There were moments, as you know, Brad, in the Catholic political tradition where guys made, like Dante, made claims about the universal world order, universal world governance, and connected it very closely to the same kinds of claims that popes made. I don't think either in terms of the Catholic tradition or in terms of logic that those claims necessarily need to accompany each other. We're seeing an emergence, among some Catholics of kind of reinvigoration of an integralist conception of political order, which might draw on that kind of thing. But I don't think that that's, as you know or should know, right, there's enough disagreement within the Catholic tradition itself about the nature of these kinds of claims. I certainly do give, if you want to sort of place me, right, within the Catholic tradition or in the broader Christian tradition, I give a, let's call it a kind of more Augustinian reading of these things. It's not alien to the Catholic tradition, but it's different than some that might be a little bit more, let's call it Thomistic, right? But even there you're going to go like, I'm not going to want to say I'm not Thomistic. I'm going to say Thomas was a good Augustinian, whereas when I run into my colleagues and say, no, he wasn't, he was more an Aristotelian, right? So I don't, cheeky question. I don't think it's a Protestant conception here. It's one that recognizes, right, the real good and the real juridical force of international law, right, as a kind of coming into being of certain kinds of natural law and jus gentium claims that have been around since at least the Romans. The Romans thought they were ancient when they had them. These are claims that have been in the Western patrimony as claims against empires or against states that didn't accompany the same kinds of ecclesial jurisdictional claims. Is that kind of like?
Sure.
It's a great question. We can talk about it over coffee.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Okay, yeah. Other questions? Strand.
You say that, and I'm happy that you say that international governance is not something that we ought to pursue, at least on Christian grounds necessarily. What do you make of international law then? Because some will agree with that, say, yeah, well, United Nations,
right.
Sort of global governance, this is Antichrist, bad idea. But they still want to hold to some sort of norm. It seems like this is what you want to do, that there's some sort of normative order still binding us together. It sounds like kind of common humanity and then
right.
the reign of Christ.
Right.
How do you actually make that operative? What sort of bodies are going to enforce this, or is it something that we just hold up as an ideal and say we have this international body that has certain norms, and is it enforced by states against other states? Is it enforced sort of how do you see that coming together?
Yeah, I pointed to like the International Court of Justice, right? I do point to international law. I mean, these are actual institutions, and they're institutions that I think are supported by this account.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to want to resist, like I said, an institution, a kind of world governing authority that projects a claim about right. And again, and what it's doing there is understanding that claim to be a sovereign type claim of the sort that states now, which arguably, some like Pierre Monnet and others have argued that this is all Protestant moves, right? These are all, right? I find that to be both, sort of ecumenically impolite and also historically shorthand, right? But I get what he's saying. Like, these are all false conceptions of sovereignty that arguably can trace to certain kinds of Reformation arguments, but also can trace backwards, even to certain false conceptions of sovereignty, right, that are in the Catholic tradition as well. Nonetheless, you said this as well. Generally, Christians are going to agree about something like a moral order, right? This is the part of realism that none of us discussed. When we say realist, right, part of what we're claiming is we are acting in a way that is most in accord with reality, right? And not reality as it's empirically tested and so on, but reality as a given that is revealed to us, right, by God and in scriptures, that is revealed also by nature, right? If you read the book of nature, this is, classic Middle Ages language, right? There's a reality there, a reality about male-female, going back, to the presentation earlier, reality about, human beings in society and so on. There's a real thing there we're all responding to, and there's an order, right, that is kind of associated with that we can perceive. Now, there's going to be kinds of tonal differences among Protestants and Catholics, or different kinds of Protestants and different kinds of Catholics about how much of that we can perceive, but we're all kind of talking about natural law. And one of the wonderful things in all of our tradition, in our shared traditions, is even before there was the EU and the UN and the World Court and so on, all these institutions, every once in a while, people would stop themselves, Christians would stop themselves and say, wait a minute, is what we're doing, right, actually morally right? One of the most famous instances of this, as we started talking about it over lunch, was when the Spaniards are discovering the New World and they're beginning to basically pillage it. They stop. They actually have a theological convocation to argue by what right are we exercising, right, ourselves in the New World. Do we actually have a right claim here? We have, of course, the sort of raw claim of power, right, or state interest. But they were saying, no, that's not enough. Right, we're actually subordinate to something else. And that's all this is deriving from, is the notion of something to which even rulers are subordinate, okay? And that's available in the Jus Gentium. The Romans themselves pointed to the Jus Gentium as an example of this. The Spaniards drew on this to say, is there a right of travel? Is there a right of trade? Is there a right of the native populations to say no, and so on, right? So it's been there, and it can be institutionalized, and it is, in some ways, institutionalized right now for us. It's imperfect and so on, but all that I think is defensible. I this perspective? Yes, way back.
I think even for this conversation, this is a really nerdy IR theory question.
Really nerdy what question?
International relations theory.
Oh, okay.
So when you're talking about realism, a lot of international relations theorists will make a distinction between sort of structural neorealism, which has an epistemological assumption of rational empiricism, and more classical or neoclassical realism, which is less deterministic and roots its conception in more of an understanding of human nature that is sort of borrowed from Christianity in some respects.
Yeah.
Do you think that, I think certainly, I take your point about deterministic neorealism not being able to be harmonized with the just war tradition. I think that's a point well taken. What about the more sort of neoclassical variant? Are there some possible symmetries and ways to harmonize that with the just war ethic?
Yeah, no, I first of all, thank you for the nerd warning, because that certainly applied. You used the word epistemological, right? No, look, great question, and the simple answer is yes. I do personally agree with the distinction and say for sure, right, there will be places where there are deep affinities between them. Thank you. We can talk about that. Is there time, Mark, for another question? Or
Yes.
Is there another question or two? All right, if not.
Thank you, Chuck.
Thank you.